The Cancer Diet, a memoir on resilience and redemption, written by Frank M. Anderson. Both the text and this narration were published by Fulcrum and Axis Press. Narrated by Frank M. Anderson in the Fulcrum and Axis Press studio, Greenville, South Carolina. Copyright 2025 by Frank M. Anderson. All rights reserved. No portion of this book or narration may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author, except as permitted by U.S. copyright law. Content note. This memoir contains candid reflections on cancer, addiction, sexual trauma, adoption, grief, and mental illness. These are my truths, told as clearly as I can bear to share them. If you are in a vulnerable place, please take care while reading. AI collaboration notice. This book was written and edited by the author in collaboration with artificial intelligence, AI tools, including OpenAI's ChatGPT. The AI was used to support the writing process through brainstorming, structural feedback, editorial refinement, and conversational development. All final content decisions were made by the author. The thoughts, stories, and experiences presented in this work are entirely personal and based on the author's life. Dedication. For everyone who's ever lived with more questions than answers. This is for you. Welcome to the Cancer Diet. This is a memoir that begins in the middle, because that's where life tends to meet us. There's no clean origin point here, no tidy summary of where we're headed, just a voice trying to make sense of a life interrupted and everything that unraveled and rebuilt in its wake. Yes, this is a story about cancer, but also about heartbreak, addiction, disconnection, reunion, and the quiet ache of simply being alive. It's about what happens when the version of yourself you've been carrying no longer fits, and the terrifying, beautiful freedom of figuring out what comes next. What? More than anything, it's an account of what it's like to live with functional depression. My brain often operates like a negative vortex, filtering out joy, distorting memory, and turning even small pain into something massive. That doesn't mean I don't experience joy. I laugh, I crack jokes, I can be warm and deeply present. But in these pages, you may not always see that, because this book wasn't written from a single mood. Some entries come from places of clarity, others from exhaustion, fear, or mania. It's hard even for me to label which is which. It would be easy to be angry at some of the events described here, but I ask you to remember, they are not the whole story. This isn't a courtroom transcript. It's a survival log, a record of what I carried, what I let go of, and what still haunts the edges. Some of what's shared here may be difficult for people who know me, especially family. But it wasn't written to hurt anyone. It was written to survive, to stop pretending certain truths weren't there just because they were uncomfortable. This is not an accusation. It's an account. Artificial intelligence plays a role in this story, but not as a gimmick. I collaborated with ChatGPT during the second half of writing, not to replace my voice, but to help me find it. AI became a mirror, a companion, a way to sort through the flood of memory when language failed me. There are hundreds of pages of our conversations that lived in earlier versions of this text, but I shaved them down as much as possible so we don't get bogged down in the telling. The thoughts are mine. The pain is mine, but I welcomed help carrying it. Memory is the thread here, not as a fixed archive, but as something alive. Something that shifts depending on when and how you hold it. This book lives on that unstable ground. It's about staying honest, even when the truth is slippery. It's about meaning without certainty, love without resolution. The title, The Cancer Diet, isn't just about illness. It's a metaphor for everything we're asked to digest in this life. The nourishment and the poison. The things that save us and the things that nearly end us. Cancer was a turning point, but it wasn't the whole story. This memoir touches on parenting, mental illness, fractured faith, first loves, last words, and the long, strange journey of trying to be good in a world that rarely rewards it. It's not a redemption arc, it's a record of survival. And sometimes that's more honest. But before we go any further, let me tell you something else. This book contains a lot of pain, Much of it is emotional, some self-inflicted, some passed down, and some carried silently for years. I imagine it makes for a painful read. That's especially true, I suspect, for my parents. I worry how they'll receive this, knowing that what's written here isn't the whole of my life, only the parts that demanded to be let out. Because here's the truth, I've experienced an incredible amount of joy too. It doesn't always make it onto the page, not because it isn't real, but because, like the pain, it can be overwhelming. The beauty of this world often brings me to tears. People fascinate me. Life pulses with moments so rich they feel holy. And still, people can be so hard to deal with. I have little patience for pretense and do my best to meet every moment honestly, even if it's messy. My childhood was filled with those moments of near unbearable joy. I remember flying down the hill outside my parents' house on my three-wheeler, brake slamming at the very last second, just before the sidewalk dropped into the road below. I remember the creek behind the neighbor's house, where water pooled in a quiet, shaded bend beneath a mansion owned by a woman who had invested in Microsoft before anyone knew what it was. I played with a cast of unforgettable characters, friends who made me laugh, made me feel seen, made me feel alive. Those memories are real and they live in me, even if the darker storms tend to come forward more quickly now. I hope this record doesn't wound the people I love, especially not my parents. This is not an indictment, it's a kind of reconciliation. Most of my suffering, I think, comes down to how I've perceived the world. That becomes pretty clear as you make your way through these pages. But even in my lowest moments, I have never stopped being grateful for my parents, for my son, for the people who've walked alongside me even when I didn't make it easy. I want people to know my pain. That's part of what this book is. But before anything else, I want them to understand this. It's not the whole story. Chapter 1. Justification for a Higher Education, September 19th, 2023. I found out I had cancer today. Years ago, I made a promise to myself that once I inevitably got cancer, I'd start this, whatever the fuck this is going to be. I envision segments about my life interspersed with thoughts on different media, family photos, half-written creative writing attempts, and other random detritus from the wreckage that is my life. Why did I think cancer was inevitable? Because nearly everything we do these days can cause cancer in some form, from the food we eat down to the very thoughts in our minds, chemicals in the water, x-rays in the air, pollution in the sea, and bad vibes thrown at us in every outlet of the so-called lives we live these days. But I don't want this whole thing to be a treatise on how fucked up this world is. Although a lingering theme in this work is going to be that our world is screwed almost beyond repair, and the only thing we can do to save it is by being as good as we can to each other. What I do want is to entertain and inform you as we analyze this fucked up creature called Frank. Yes, I just spoke of myself in third person. You won't catch me doing that much, but it's appropriate here because you, the audience, will inevitably get many different versions of me as this whole thing goes down. What thing am I talking about? Well, my death, of course. Morbid? Maybe. But if I'm going to leave anything behind, I want people to know that I was here, I lived, I mattered, and I did it with style. Not with an elegant, savvy, or even especially smart style, but in one my very own. If there's one thing I do know for sure, it's that I have my own way of expressing myself. For how hard I've worked to Swiss cheese my memory, I have access to a million little stories, thoughts, sounds, scribblings, and snippets that I think can clearly give you an idea of just who the fuck I was and why I felt like I had enough to say to make your time reading this worthwhile. So back to death, because we will be doing that a lot. I don't actually expect to die soon. In typical Frank fashion, I can't even get one of the cool cancers that will make for some stunning, heart-wrenching accounts of a desperate fight for survival. Nope, instead, I got one of the easiest to treat cancers you can get. Skin cancer. A blessing? You bet your britches. But not the best scenario for the purposes of this writing. I made this deal with myself to start writing this, and by God, I'm going to do it. but it would have been nice to have the audience behind me even more from the start because things are going to get ugly here. Meaning, I also promised myself I would be as honest as I possibly can be with myself and my audience while writing this. Dash, 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 comma, comma, comma. Sorry, my cat walked across the keyboard and I don't know a better transition here, so I'm going to leave it for now. Well, motherfucker. Life is crazy. I got a call as I was typing that last sentence, and it was my mom. She sounded panicked and told me someone was coming to pick me up. She must have thought she hung up because I heard the phone click, but could still hear her talking. At first, I was afraid they were freaking out about my cancer diagnosis and were shipping me off to rehab because the fear of winding up in the asylum or rehab is always strong for an addictive, depressive, bipolar fool like myself. I could only hear the things they said faintly and garbled, like the mom's voice from the old 80s show Muppet Babies. I heard my mom and another female, which I thought was my brother's wife, and realized quickly that it wasn't her, but her mom, which I figured out because I heard her dad, Jack Key, talking. I couldn't imagine what the fuck was going on, but I knew it was something serious. So I got my stuff and walked out the front door of my condo and waited on the steps outside. It was a sunny day and the world felt oddly quiet. As I waited, a neighbor passed by and offered platitudes, which I quickly brushed off as nicely as I could. I didn't have much in me to people on a good day, and this was shaping up to be a bad day. After a few minutes in the quiet, a van pulled up from the street running beside my red brick condo. I recognized it as my brother's wife's parents' van as it pulled in closer around the curb, leading toward the lines of parking spaces beside my building. I saw my father sitting in the passenger seat, his bald head spotted with red, which happens when he gets upset sometimes. His hand was lifted up, rubbing his eyes. As the van pulled into an open parking space in front of the stairs upon which I sat, the door to the driver's passenger side opened. My mom emerged and walked up to me, putting her hand on my arm. She said, "Your brother has died." I suppose this is where I should insert all the emotions I felt upon hearing this, but the truth is, I'm so used to shitty things happening and am so used to looking for the worst things to happen that when something this massively shitty does happen, I kind of snap into trauma response, which goes like this. 1. Shut off all, or at least as many thought processes as possible. 2. Respond only to things you know are happening because my brain will come up with a million potential scenarios and I have to make sure I am following along with reality, not some image of what could or should be happening in my head. 3. React as little as possible because committing to any certain path in the early stages of chaos and tragedy can put you on a path you can't get out of. 4. Be as supportive as you can of everyone else. 5. Don't let any emotion in or out. Shove that shit way down. Dad got out of the car and walked up to me with a sheepish look I don't think I've ever seen before. I didn't know exactly what to say, so I asked Dad how he was. He shrugged a bit and said, "Not good." I guess that was the first moment I actually felt something seeing Dad like that. My father is a titan of strength, poise, and determination. He has been in declining health over the last year, including his own bout with cancer, back surgeries, and a general decline in cognitive function that can mostly be attributed to his age, but could also be scary signs of more pressing cognitive issues. I knew that this could break him, and that frightened me. He and my brother shared a special bond, to the point that he and my mother had divided Greg and me between each other, with him handling my brother most of the time, and me being handled by my mother. Dad was followed by Mary Leslie's parents, Jack and Mary Sue Key. I quickly became concerned for Jack, too. He has gone through multiple heart surgeries and has a pacemaker, and I knew the stress of something like this could be bad for him as well. Of course, it was easier to think about what could happen to them than it was to think about the cold, hard fact that I had just learned my brother, who I always expected to outlive me, and who was seemingly in much better health than me, was dead. I shook Jack's hand and hugged Mary Sue. When they asked me to ride with them, I politely refused and offered to drive myself. Mom replied that it was fine for me to drive myself and that she would ride with me. We got in my old black Mercedes 4X4 and rode a quiet drive down the few streets it takes to get to my brother's house. We all live within a few blocks radius of each other, my parents' home being only a bit further away than my brother's. When we pulled up to the small brick, obsessively manicured drive, there were cars lining the street, cop cars, ambulances, and a few rubbernecking neighbors. He's still in there, Mom said. The police are too, so we need to stay out of their way. It was an obvious statement, but what does one say in this kind of situation? Cliché is created for times like this. It's a perfect script you can follow to get from one shitty event to the next. Mom and I walked in through the white-framed glass storm door. Jack, Mary Sue, and my father were walking in front of us and entered first, taking turns hugging my brother's wife, Mary Leslie, who is a truly amazing woman and a saint for putting up with my brother. She is a celebrated middle school principal who had just learned she won the Principal of the Year award for our school district, which is one of the largest in the country. Tears poured down her cheeks and she held tight to each of them. When she got to me, she looked me in the eyes and started to cry a bit harder. Now, I love to sling around cuss words with wild abandon. This world is fucking obscene, and if you clutch your pearls at foul language, well, you have probably already quit reading this, but I firmly believe that in the face of the everlasting tragedy of this world, there's only one valid response. What the fuck? I said as I held her close. She gave a wry laugh, shook her head, and said, I don't know, before I was forced to come up with a more appropriate follow-up. A female police officer emerged from the back of their art and fancy knick-knack-adorned house. Is this the family? She said. More to us all than one individual person. Mary Leslie nodded. This is his parents and brother. I want to see him, my dad said in no uncertain terms. The officer looked down and pondered for a second. We have some more things to do in there. No one is allowed anywhere else in the house until we are done, but we will see what we can do. I want to see him, Dad repeated, as if the matter had been decided. The den of my brother's house is painted a pleasant yellowish beige, and the walls are covered in original, colorful works of art. Some of my paintings from back when I used to be more creative dot the walls in a few places. It always surprised me how steadfast my brother was in keeping my art. He paid for it to be put in expensive frames, and they hung in full sight, a rare sign of affection and even admiration. Greg and I were oddly close and very distant. He was 5 years older than me, and this meant that we were always in distinctly different phases of life. When I went into elementary school, he moved up to middle school. Once his high school years were over, he moved on to college, leaving me alone with my parents. When we were kids, I remember him being a mix of deeply affectionate and totally repulsed by my existence. We were both adopted at birth. My parents had met in the army and married. They spent a lot of their newly married years in Germany and settled in Greenville because my mom's family was from here, and Dad went to Furman University. Dad grew up in North Augusta, Georgia, which was famous for two things: being the hometown of one James Brown and adjacent to Augusta proper, home of the Masters golf tournament. We were Southern to the core, but city folk as well, and lived in Greenville, South Carolina, where nothing could be finer, as the famous song went. After one of those endlessly stretched out moments where nothing and everything happened at the same time, my family played out how they had learned about Greg. I knew something was wrong when he didn't pick up the dogs at the groomer, Mary Leslie said. I called Meredith to get them and came home as soon as I could because Greg wasn't answering his phone. Meredith is Mary Leslie's sister. Greg not answering his phone was actually a pretty regular occurrence. His company, Anderson Restoration, had a rather large client list of some of Greenville's most influential and wealthy people. House restoration is how Greg described his job, but what this really meant was that he did anything from glorified handyman work to large-scale projects such as completely revamping houses, which he did mostly on his own with a helper or two. But Greg was fastidious to a fault and had a hard time letting other people do things differently than he wanted done. His phone would go off at almost any time of day, with people needing him for things as far under his skill set as fixing toilets, to as in his wheelhouse as restoring cars or building new construction, and they had no gumption about calling him, even if they knew he was busy with something else or even on vacation. After a bit more bandying about how everyone found out what was going on, the officers and representatives of the morgue came back out and said they were going to let people come in to see Greg. Mom and Dad went to look, but I held back. Greg was very persnickety about how he looked, and I wanted to give him the dignity of not being fawned over. Or maybe it was that I just didn't want to see. I don't know. When Mom and Dad came back, I could see the weight on them both. Greg and my parents always had an interesting relationship. Greg was fiercely independent, and my family is uniquely poor at communicating, so this sometimes led to conflict, which was usually followed by Greg separating himself until things smoothed over. Dad would often ask me how Greg was doing, like he thought I had a better idea than him of what my brother was up to and how he was. Truth is, Greg and I mostly kept up because I would check in with him every few days or even weeks. Other than that, I called if I needed something. Lately, he and I had been talking a bit more often due to Dad's health, but Greg was a busy guy who I would say worked himself to death. Greg grew up obsessed with cars, nice things, and projects. He enjoyed the finer things in life from an early age, from watching Miami Vice and Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, to reading Robb Report, a magazine for wealthy car enthusiasts. Greg wanted the best life had to offer and believed in working hard to obtain those things. When he was a tween, he found an oversized, elongated poster that featured a mansion standing in a beautifully lit sunset and a prominently placed garage filled with multiple luxury cars, and the slogan, "Justification for a Higher Education," emblazoned across its bottom. Greg treasured that poster. He often talked about how many cars he wanted to own once he was old enough to actually drive a car. He would spend hours in my parents' driveway driving the Thing, an old burgundy Volkswagen, up and down the driveway, almost like a thoroughbred horse, waiting impatiently for the gun to go off to launch itself into a race head first. That made it the ultimate shock to see his body carried out of his bedroom and placed on a gurney. Once he was loaded in, one of the representatives from the city morgue and the police carefully pulled back the flap on the body bag he was in, and I saw my brother's face for the last time. His head was slightly turned, so I couldn't see anything but his left cheek. He was unshaven and, to his horror, wearing an Old Holy t-shirt. Greg was always so meticulous about his appearance. He would have hated this. My brother was a polo man through and through. Much like fine cars and food, Greg loved fine clothes. Someone fix his hair. It took me a moment to realize the words had come from my mouth. Greg was serious about his hair. He used to spend what felt like hours in the bathroom, styling it while talking to girls or friends on the phone. He had started losing his hair over the last few years, a fact I could barely acknowledge without laughing at the irony. Him losing his hair while I, someone who wouldn't care at all, kept every strand felt like one of life's cruel punchlines. Another reason cancer doesn't scare me as much as it should. Mary Leslie nodded, stepped forward and smoothed his hair back, her hands shaking slightly as she leaned in and kissed him. That small, tender act broke something in me. One of the city workers bowed his head and put his hand on my dad's shoulder, murmuring a quiet prayer. Then they carted Greg away. Chapter 2, What Survives the Noise. September 28th, 2023. It's been almost a week since my brother's death. I keep thinking I should be ready to talk about it by now. The funeral, the flood of people, the flowers, the photos looped on that screen like a highlight reel of a life that never felt finished. It was lovely, I guess. Big, beautiful. Greg was honored and represented pretty well, but I don't want to write about that. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered more than I can say, but because it feels too big and too polished to touch just yet. Like I'd be desecrating something sacred if I tried to pin it down in words before I'm ready. And I don't want to talk about cancer either. Not today. Even though I've got surgery tomorrow. And even though there's this gnawing feeling in my gut that something's not right. That there's more hiding beneath the surface. I felt off for a long time. Tired, heavy, disconnected. And I can't help but let my brain spin on what might be waiting in that pathology report. But we'll come back to that. We have time. Right now, I want to talk about something else. Something softer, something messier, something harder to define, and somehow even more persistent than death or illness. I want to talk about love. Because if there's one thing grief has a way of doing, it's cracking you open. It clears the table, and what's left, when all the noise dies down, are the people who filled your life with meaning, the ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who made you feel like you were worth something, even for a moment. So to make sense of all this, I'm going to take us back to where it started, not with death, but with love.